So in the previous video, we looked at QTP checkpoints. We inserted some QTP checkpoints and we verified both pass and fail state of those checkpoints. So I hope that you got a pretty good or a decent idea about QTP and checkpoints. So again, I have saved this script, the previous script of QTP checkpoint, as QTP checkpoints so that you will also have a copy of this script and all of those files, as well as the object repositories. So in this video, we will discuss parameterization. So what parameterization is exactly, what it is you can see in this script, as you can see in this script, we have basically navigated to facebook.com. And then we entered some email ID, which is hi@yahoo.com. And then we entered some password. In this case, it's set secure. And that is the reason that we can't see the password. So parameterization is all about parameterizing all of this data, all of the input data. In this case, we have two input data. One is email, and the second is the password. So we can parameterize. In this case, we have constant values, a hi@yahoo.com as the email ID, and that's the constant value for email ID. Parameterizing is all about using dynamic and multiple sets of value, using multiple sets of data. So if I want to test the login functionality of Facebook using two different email IDs and two different passwords, right? So what exactly do I have to do? The first thing that may come to your mind is that you can copy the exact code. I can do a Control-C. Okay. Let's say this is part 1, and this is part 2. By the way, when I write part 1 and part 2, I did, as you notice, I have a single quotation. I begin my line with a single quotation, and that's the reason that this line is commented, which means that QTP won't try to read this line. This is just for my information. So if you want to just write some notes into the codes, if I do not put this, then as you can see, this is part 1, became converted into a blue font. So blue font means, in this case, at least for my code, I have all of my code in blue font. That means QTP will assume that this is also part of the codes, but it's not. So this is just for my notes. So I'll put a single quote, same thing here, part 1, part 2. So just for my notes. So we will discuss in detail about that a little more later on. So part 1 is this, and let's put part 2. Same thing. I just copy the same thing into part 2. What I want to do is test the login functionality of two different kinds of invalid ID. So let's say part 1 is hi@yahoo.com and password is, well, let's change the password. So instead of set secure, so just set. So let's just put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Close the quotation. And part 2, let's say we want to do hi@, and we can also name this part 1 email ID as email ID part 1@yahoo.com, just for testing purposes. And we want to do that the second time. We want to put part 2 @yahoo.com. And also we will change the password, set secure to set, let's put a different password, 78910. Okay? And let's try to execute this. Okay? So let me just close the browser before I start running this script. So we close it. So you'll know exactly what I'm doing. So this script basically tries to navigate to facebook.com, enter part 1 at yahoo.com, and is checking for the checkpoint. But the checkpoint will fail because it's checking for the email address. It's checking for the email address to be valid, but this time the error message that we have is different than what we are expecting. So let me just stop this test and let's take out the checkpoint from the script. So line number 10 is the checkpoint. So I just took that out, I took out the checkpoint. So this time we're getting a different error message and QTP won't recognize this error message. Okay? So instead, we can put a different checkpoint. We can click on run, click on record, and insert checkpoint, standard checkpoint, and click on this value here, and with the hand sign, and click OK again, and the checkpoint was inserted. So we replaced the checkpoint with a new checkpoint, with a new error message. So we'll just stop the recording, close the browser, and we want to have the same checkpoint, line number 10. We want to have the same checkpoint for part 2. So after the login, we also want to replace this checkpoint, the second one. This was the old checkpoint, and I want to replace it with the new one. Your account is temporarily blocked. So we have part 1 and part 2, same code, same checkpoints, everything is the same except we have different data. So in this case, we have part 1 at yahoo.com, second time we have part 2 at yahoo.com. So we want QTP to check the login functionality with 2 different email IDs and 2 different passwords. So in a quick, we'll run this test. So part 1, yahoo.com, close the browser and check the checkpoint. Now let's see what happens. So now it tries to execute part 2. It goes to facebook.com and then, as you can see, enters part 2 at yahoo.com. And this time it has a different checkpoint. So this checkpoint will fail the second time because it has a different, this time I have a different error message. So for good, I can just delete my checkpoint for both part 1 and part 2 because I don't need those checkpoints. So using different email IDs are giving me different checkpoints, so QTP will get confused. So I took off all those checkpoints. So this is the script. This script, basically what it does, it checks the login functionality with different sets of data. So let's run this test again without any checkpoints. Navigating to facebook.com, entering part 1 at yahoo.com, closing the browser. Then it will go to part 2. It's navigating again to facebook.com, entering part 2 at yahoo.com, and the password that we have provided, so 78910, and it will try to close the browser. So it actually did close the browser. Good. We have just used multiple sets of data. So why do we even need parameterization? So in this case, I have tested the login functionality of Facebook with 2 different kinds of, or 2 different email IDs and passwords. What if I need to test the same login functionality with hundreds and thousands of sets of data? then I have to copy this same code again to part 3, part 4, part 5, part 6, and so on and so on and so on and so on. So we have to use the same, we have to copy the same code over and over. And this will take a lot of time. So QTP actually has a better idea. QTP has something called parameterization that we can use, and we can use the same code, but we can parameterize the value. So the same code we can use, we can parameterize the value. Let me close part 2, and let's just have part 1. Okay? And I can have this same code. I will not make any changes to the code, and I can still test the application with multiple sets of data. This is called parameterization, and in the next video, we'll look deeper into it.